Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of 10,000 Heroes. I'm your host, Ankur Shah Delight. This is episode 101, and so for over 100 episodes now, we've been engaged in this inquiry into purpose. My concept, 10,000 Heroes, is that a hero is someone who knows their purpose and is living it. Usually, I would think, for the benefit of themselves, their family, their community, and all being, of course, is the goal. So that's the invitation here, and that's maybe the belief or the thesis is that sense of clarity of purpose, of crystal clear, this is why I'm here, is available to all of us, and that's what I'm trying to get at in different ways through every solo cast, every interview, every episode. So this episode is an interview with an old friend of mine, Mike Taubman, who's a teacher in New York, and the key word for me is conscientious. And that's what Mike is made of. He's dedicated his life to teaching with this incredible gift of conscientiousness, as well as, of course, skill and intellect and all the other good things that come along with that. And so I asked him a little bit about the future of education. And I have to say, while I love interacting with Mike and I love his ideas, I don't fully agree. And not that I know the answer or anything like that. But the inquiry is really important. And if we really chose to make it our number one priority as a nation to focus on education, what would that look like? So, take it away, Mike.
The thing I think about a lot in general is education, and both like specifically in terms of the classroom and the world of education, K-12 education, and then also my own experience and other people's experience as students in various levels. But then, I've been listening to a bunch of your podcasts, especially in the last week or so. And this idea of conflict, I think is a really interesting one to explore in education, the ways conflict emerges in that and can be transformative. And then also, your list of like hero characteristics. There's a lot of ways in which I think an education, one way to think about education is helping young people find those characteristics in themselves or develop them.
Wouldn't that be the best way to think about education as a society? Is like, here's a process that we can help young people go through so they emerge as heroes in their own lives.
I mean, yeah.
All right. Well, so let's start there. From all of your experience as a student and as an educator and just an incredibly thoughtful and conscientious person who's had lots of exposure to data of what it's like to be a high school student and to work with high school students. If that was our goal as a society, if the next president and the next governor of every state and everybody was like, hey, we want to invest everything we can, resources, intention, priority, to making education the vehicle by which every young person comes out of this system as a hero in their own lives and can contribute to themselves and their families and their communities and society as a whole. What would they design? what would they fund? What would they do?
It's a great question. I think the way I've been thinking about this recently is in one of your recent episodes, you talked about dialectical synthesis, which I can't even say, but
dialectical synthesis.
There's a whole song, as I recall, about it.
Dialectical synthesis.
Oh, you've added a bass note.
I like that. I just improv on it.
I think there's a dialectical relationship or kind of a conflict in a healthy way in the education system between how to think about heroism, to use this language, how to think about heroism in its sort of deepest soulful sense and in its outward expression of being able to kind of navigate and critically navigate the world as it exists today. And so I think, to start to answer your question, an education system that helped young people become the heroes of their own lives would be one in which they were going inside and outside, inward and outward, in equal measure, in both very kind of broad senses and also in very specific senses, so that at the end of it, whether they ended in 12th grade or they ended in after community college or after college or went straight to the workforce, whatever it is, they were prepared as they entered their adult lives to be grounded, but also to have a set of navigational charts to use. So like 4 metaphors in there.
Yes, there are. And so I'm gonna have a slow down and unpack them.
Yep.
Grounded and have a set of navigational charts. That's interesting. And then before that, you were talking about internal and external ways of navigating the world.
Yeah.
Broadly and specifically.
Yeah.
So could we hit all four of those quadrants, like internal broadly, internal specifically, external broadly, external specifically? What do you mean by each of those four?
So let's start with external, because I think external is often where our current system is aimed in various ways. I mean, there's a lot of talk of values, and I think there are values being taught in schools all the time, explicitly and implicitly. But I think that by and large, the American education system was partly designed for economic preparation.
Yeah.
So there was always kind of an outward sense to it in that sense.
And it seems like there's been waves of how much it's focused on that over time. Like there's the whole like university culture and the idea that we're going to teach everyone this broad spectrum of, general education so they can be fully prepared humanists. There was a whole era of that. And I feel like I went to college, you went to college, at Stanford in the very late 90s, early 2000s. In my mind, it was almost like that was declining a little bit. And it was like, man, we got to get these people some jobs and teach them some math and some computer science. And I don't know where we're at now, but I can imagine these like waves going up and down.
The waves, whichever direction you want to call it, the wave has gone a very different direction than when we were in school. I mean, I don't have all the data, but the data I have seen suggests that humanities majors and as a whole are in decline. I think some people say they're in crisis. And across the country, there are more and more tech majors happening, STEM majors, and nothing wrong with STEM and tech. Those are important parts of life. But the ratio has kind of been skewed in this way where STEM and tech have become more and more popular. And to the point where you've probably seen some of these articles too, like smaller universities are considering closing or merging various humanities departments or ending certain majors in the humanities for budgetary reasons. But I think right now we're at a moment where both in college and in the K-12 space, we are at the point where the external realities of economic life in particular are becoming the guiding lights of a lot of what's happening in K-12 education. But, I will say, and again, this is going back to the sort of the dialectic and the necessary tension and conflict here, not without good reason in a lot of cases. I mean, you want everybody to be able to navigate that space. And I think, this is part of what Momentum Lab is doing as well, is without a full awareness of what life entails, people will be less able to navigate it.
Yeah.
But I think that to answer your question that you asked earlier, what happens in K-12 schools a lot of the time to prepare students for that is we look at life as a series of skills that can be mastered more or less, or outlooks that can be developed more or less. And the goal is to develop those specific skills and outlooks as much as possible while they're in school. So for example, literacy. I was an English teacher. I'm an English teacher. And so the ability to both actually read a book, which I'm watching my daughters learn how to do right now, and then later to analyze a book and write about it and all that, we have decided, I think correctly, that is a life skill that then can be taught and measured. And we can have a sense of whether students are more or less able to do that. So they have these national exams where they say, like, this percent of eighth graders are able to read on grade level, and we can decide as a country how that's going. But I would put that all on that quadrant you discussed of exterior, external.
Yeah, you had made a distinction between like broadly and specifically.
Yeah.
So is that exterior specific?
Yeah, broad? That's exterior specific is literacy.
Okay.
Or certain math skills or STEM skills.
Okay. Right. Specific skills.
Yeah.
And then what is the exterior broad?
I would say that's more the outlooks, which is a kind of way of thinking about the world in these different disciplines. So like take the scientific method. The idea that even though I was an English major and I'm an English teacher, that I'm vaguely aware of that there should be hypotheses that are falsifiable, and that then you run an experiment, gather evidence and change the hypothesis. That's a broad outlook on the world that the K-12 system wants young people to have, is an awareness of the scientific method and using that both as scientists if they become that, but also just as a way of looking at reality.
Yeah. Okay. And you're not trying to take down either of these things. You're not anti-literacy, and you're not anti the outlook of the scientific method.
No, I'm not anti those things.
Okay. So what's the internal side that you want to complement that with?
Okay. The internal qualities, I would say the internal, going back to specific, there are lots of schools have thought about this right now in the K-12 space. Like there was a period where grit was something that was being discussed a lot. Another example would be growth mindset.
Yeah.
These are kind of specific skills, and they have subsets of skills that, again, can be taught and measured, and we can see how students are doing with them. But they are more about a student. It's not about whether a student can read or conduct a scientific experiment. It's if they try to read a book and they can't, how do they respond to that?
Yeah.
Not with a literacy approach, but with a psychological response or an emotional response. So that I would characterize those as the specific internal. But then the broad internal, I think of all the quadrants here, this is the one that probably interests you and me a lot, but also is probably the one that is least discussed in the K-12 space right now, is how do we develop values that are both received but also investigated upon their reception. We don't just take them at face value.
Yeah.
And that also get translated from important complex conversations about the values to daily life strategies, daily life practices that embody those values.
Yeah.
And I think you could make that, I think that's something I've been working on recently, is how do you make those values something that you could teach and measure, et cetera. But they run a little deeper in my mind than grit or growth mindset, even though those are also both important.
Yeah. Wow. That just opens up a lot of connections for me. So maybe I'll just share some things that are on my mind.
Please. Yeah.
So, I think about Gandhi a lot. There's a phase of my life where I spent a lot of time reading Gandhi, literally walking in Gandhi's footsteps, and just kind of immersing myself in like, what the hell was going on with Gandhi, and how did he get so wacky and so powerful and all this stuff? And his philosophy of education is very different, of course, like anything he does. And he, I think he started these schools first in South Africa and then in India, and there was a whole like movement called Nai Talim, like new education movement. And I think there were basically two things that he thought should be taught in schools. And the first was languages. And this is like specific to a context of India where it's this incredibly diverse amalgamation of cultures and ethnicities and principalities that's trying to be like one country. And so languages was really important in order just to understand the people around you. And religion. And he wanted like all the kids to be taught all the religions. And so it was this kind of like pluralist values and language concept. And he's like, and the rest will just come. So it's interesting to me in terms of these four quadrants that you're outlining. That's the one that we're just maybe having the hardest time with right now. And it's interesting in that as a pluralist democracy that is ostensibly secular and to like, pretty successful usually in terms of being secular, I think we've had a hard time with the values piece.
Yeah.
And it would be a lot easier if everybody were Baptist to have the values piece just like really more infused. And so I'm curious how it's done. Like in your life, do you have family values that you teach your kids that are like, this is how we go through the world? And then are there different classroom values that kids are taught that may overlap or contradict or intersect with their values that they're being taught at home implicitly or explicitly?
Yeah, great question. Before I get to that one, the thing you made me think about a second ago is that the US does not have the linguistic the lots of kinds of pluralities that India does, to my understanding. But like you said, there's all these different subcultures within America, religious and otherwise.
Yeah.
And I think we can come back to this, but I want to go to your question, but there is a way to see that as an opportunity, because I think one of the things I've been thinking about a lot recently is the ways values emerge out of, maybe only exist during conversation, both literal conversation, but also the kind of ongoing conversation at a national or local level between these different communities. So that if this religious group is saying this and this secular group is saying this other religious group saying this, or even just take different careers or different communities in the country, I think that dialogue is the path forward. I mean, the theme of the season, the only way out is through. Like, the only way out of the values conundrum is through the plurality of ideas that exist in this country and and around the world, which we can come back to. But to your question, yeah, I think maybe as an educator.
I've got to interrupt that because I'm just thinking about what you just said. So it seems to me what you just said, it's equivalent to saying, and this is part of that whole integral philosophy thing of, that we talk about with Jeff Salzman on that other show. But if the people who supposedly espouse pluralism, like me and you, actually espouse pluralism, then we'd be okay. You know, because if there's like multiple camps and some of them are like, fuck you, my way is right. And there's one way that's like, oh no, it's important to have all the different points of views. But really, when they see the guy with the other hat, they're like, fuck you, my way is right.
Yeah.
Then we're all still at the same, like, unable to really be plural, like to hear a contradictory viewpoint and to go at it with curiosity and be like, oh, what does this add to my table? Rather than like, God, man, those people are a basket of deplorables or whatever the quote is.
Yeah. I think that there's an interesting way to think about education, both as an educator, but also as a student, that process, if it works correctly in almost any setting, I mean, in a school that Gandhi founded or founded in his philosophy, or a school in America today that's more traditional or whatever, there's a way to think about the classroom experience as one part of the answer to that question, because the espousal of pluralism is, I think, a first step. That's not nothing. You know, there's people espousing non-pluralism right now.
Huge. Yeah.
But then to live it, as you said, the classroom is actually a really interesting space that almost everybody goes through, at least as a child and sometimes as an adult, in which you are confronted with the reality of that espousal. Because if you're in a room and you're talking about something and somebody says the opposite of what you think, it's a moment. As a student, as a teacher, you know, you're expecting something as a teacher, or another student, you said one thing, they just disagreed with you. And I think going back to your original question, one of the ways to think about education for heroism is education for listening. But not the listening of surrender, the listening of engagement, the listening of that exchange of ideas. And that is so, I mean, you know, we could talk about this for a while now if we want, but like that is such a hard thing to help young people do, and then to do as an adult. And if you can't do it, you know, if we can't do it in our personal lives, as parents, how are we supposed to help our children do it? As teachers or coaches, how are we supposed to help our students or clients do it?
Yeah, no, it is so hard. And I just want to give a little shout out to Mr. Woolley, my high school world problems teacher, who was amazing, just totally amazing gentleman. And he was so good at that you actually had no idea what he believed. He was so good at arguing the other side gently of whatever somebody came at him with that I don't think no one could leave that room or be in that discussion and feel like, oh, he's against me or he's on the other side. Because it was just so clear that he was just engaging with everything in that really deep. I love that distinction you made. You know, Gandhi talks about nonviolence as a horrible translation of ahimsa, and how it's really like, because it was often called passive resistance. And he's like, dude, this is the most active thing in the world. And that's like what you're with listening. It's like, not just like, oh, I'm just going to listen and be in my corner and have trouble taking up space. It's like the most active, engaged, like, let's get right into this, but with curiosity. So can you tell me some stories? Like, do you do that? Do you crash and burn?
I try, but yeah, definitely. The crashing and burning is part of it. And I think it's part, you know, I saw you in an email recently wrote about maybe it's Matt's quote, there isn't failure, there's just learning. Yeah. I mean, yeah, but there's a lot of learning in that sense over the course of my career to this day. But then some moments where it works, you know, it works better. So I think one way to look at that, going back to the quadrants we were talking about earlier, is in education. And I think this maybe has implications for the world outside education as well. There's a very tactical thing, which some people in the country right now in the K-12 space call having a poker face in a classroom as a teacher. And that's what Mr. Woolley did in some ways, is Mr. Woolley did not smile when he heard what he agreed with, and, you know, frown and bring his eyebrows down when he, you know, very, very specific facial things you can do, or things you can do with your body and your energy to maintain a posture of openness so students are not aware what you think. But then, you know, skipping quadrants now, that ideally either leads to or is a manifestation of the deeper capital E engagement he was doing and that you remember so well. Because if you don't have both those, you could fake engagement, but you could also engage in a way where if you're not watching what your facial features are doing, and you're the teacher in the classroom, everybody's looking at you, you could be fully engaged, capital E, but because you're not conscious of what your face is doing, give off the impression you agree or disagree with somebody. And so, I mean, to be very specific, that's something that we think about a lot in education. Something I continue to work on is how can I physically embody engagement the way we're describing it, while also internally engaging in that way, which requires, and this is a fascinating thing to think about, again, for education, but also maybe more broadly, it requires incredibly thorough preparation for that lesson or for that moment in life. We have to be thoroughly prepared, but then be so present we can leave the path we were intending to go on. Which is a teacher, again, to get specific, you have 45 minutes, however much time you have, you're trying to do X, Y, or Z. There's a chance if you leave the path, and some student said something really interesting, you leave the path, you never come back to it. The bell rings, and time is relentless, and you just never get to this chapter of the book, which is okay in some cases. But that's a kind of, I think, maybe a way of thinking about life as well, where it's like, did you do all your homework? Are you ready for this moment? And then are you also ready to let go?
Beautiful. But I think pretty unfair to ask that of the teacher, because those are two extremely, they're just levels of excellence that are orthogonal. Like just the being present and being able to let go, and the being deeply prepared are both like two different life paths that you're asking every teacher to master.
Yeah, I think of them as sequential, though, and that might be my own experience speaking. And like you said, I'm not suggesting this is easy, or day 2 or year 2 or year 12 you're doing this. But I think that one of the things I have experienced a lot in education as a student and as a young teacher, and now as a more senior teacher, is the idea of apprenticeship. And I didn't always call it that, and there's lots of ways to define that term, but to me, if you surrender to a process, in this case, learning how to teach, and you learn to teach in the first way we were saying, which is like, just be ready for your class, the things that are really the moral responsibility of the teacher, like know the book that you're about to teach, prepare the lesson, grade students' work, all these things that are like the sine qua non of education, that takes years and years and years to get excellent at. But to me, and I'm not saying this is true for everybody, but for me, towards the end of that initial apprenticeship process, which was about 10 years, this other world came into view, which is the second world of like suddenly realizing that the point of all that apprenticeship was to be present, and was to be able to move in the spirit of the room at the time, But the problem is, I think sometimes, and I made this mistake myself, we talk as if you jump to presence.
Yeah.
Like level 12 in the video game, you can put in the cheat code in Contra, and now you're just a present teacher, but you're still learning how to. No, you have to like play Contra for a while, and then you get the cheat code.
Yeah, you're a monk. You're just talking about the fetching the water and the chopping wood, and then you realize, wow.
But one of the questions this is making me think of is how we're talking, in my experience so far, multi-decade timelines, and there's more decades to come, in my career. And so one of the things I think about a lot is, how do we help young people in the time they have with us? They're not going to have that whole experience. And they're also at a point in their personal and even like brain development where that's not where their head's at. So how do we help them become aware of this without living the full thing, but so that when the time comes, they know what it is when they see it?
Yeah. Yeah. Like give them just, a taste. I mean, it almost seems like having that process that you're going through, some degree of transparency or a little like window into your own evolution, can provide that. They're like, oh, I mean, because that's one thing I didn't really get. The teachers I had that were amazing, that really changed my life, and there were a few in high school that just, I mean, I'm forever grateful and indebted to them. I don't know that I saw them as works in progress. I think I saw them as just like, wow, these people are role models. And that worked for me. That was good.
Yeah.
But to think, I mean, and I also grew up with this conception, and I don't know how common this is, but that there are things that I was excellent at, and there's things that I sucked at, and I wasn't ever going to get from box A to box B with a specific skill. I don't know. I mean, it's like the opposite of the growth mindset thing, right?
Yeah.
So I think maybe having learned about a hero or teacher of mine who had made that transition, could have given me a little more awareness that I could possibly make that transition, which I learned, maybe 15 years later. I was like, oh no, I can actually learn things.
You traveled the world and then discovered, oh yeah, I can get better at all these things. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, totally. I think that's something that there's an arc of a teaching life, and I think maybe of sort of adult in young people's lives in general, or even coach to client, or any situation which somebody has come to someone else voluntarily or involuntarily, depending on the age, to learn, right? And the arc, and there's an author who's making me think of, but the arc to me, or at least in my experience, was it's all about you as a teacher at the beginning, because it's brand new. Like, you don't know what you're doing. You're just trying to like make it day to day. And there's famous stories about being a first year teacher and all that. And I could tell some of my own. It's such a struggle. I used to cry after classes sometimes because I felt like such a failure on behalf of the students, for sure. But honestly, also like I felt like a failure in a way that my life had not really conditioned me to. Because I had if I wasn't great at something, like I loved basketball, but I was not an elite basketball player. So I found pickup basketball, and I was a very happy pickup basketball player. But that didn't require excellence of me. And if I failed in that context, it was kind of like it was next week I'll get them again.
Yeah.
You show up at your job or your responsibility is young people's futures. And if it's a school where there's expectations around what's happening, which a lot of schools that is the case, you're then confronted with your inability to do it. So long story short, it's in my experience, it's very much about you as the beginning as a teacher, but you in this kind of almost a psychological defensive crouch. It was my experience because I hadn't struggled this much at anything really before. And thank God I became a teacher, because that struggle was key to all these other parts of my life, I think, changing. But then phase two, which for a lot of people, it's year 5, year 7 is when it starts to happen in K-12 education. It stops being about you. And you're like, this is all about the students. And you suddenly like can see each of their progresses individually. It's like a light goes off, or like you can see the Matrix a little bit. Maybe not quite see the Matrix, we can save that, but like the middle of the Matrix or something, where he's like becoming aware of what's going on and he's worrying about other people, not just himself escaping the agents at the beginning of the movie. So that's the middle of teaching, where you're like, this is all about this student and that student. And how can and you're up late trying to figure out how to help them. To me, the third stage, which again, this kind of sequence we're talking about, is you realize it's necessary to deploy yourself for students' sake and make it about you in these very specific strategic ways in which you are not even you. You're just like you're presenting your life as something else to learn from. But it's not because your life is impressive. It's just because this actually is the most important teaching tool I have right now, because I'm teaching vulnerability. Yeah. And if I don't go there, there's nothing for them to learn.
Yeah. Yeah. You play the role that is needed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Beautiful trajectory.
But so I think going back to what you're saying, like that's going back to pluralism and developing heroes in education. If we're not, as educators or as managers in a business context, if we're not embodying these values, which is hard because it involves vulnerability, being wrong, failing publicly, then I think it's much easier for everybody to tune out what's happening, because you could read the best book, and if the teacher teaches it a certain way, you did your homework, you got a B, an A, and you move on.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, this is all fascinating and head exploding, but I'm going to get back to the original question because, like that's concretely, like to give the viewer or the listener, like, how is this going to change when the education president comes forward? Like, what's it going to look like? Are there going to be one teacher per 5 students? Is everyone going to sit in a circle? Is that all going to be outside in forests? Do we still have books? Is it like AI grading? What's the way to make this work where the people come out of the system and, like intact physically and mentally, spiritually, ready to participate, contribute in society, all kinds of skills, hard skills, soft skills? Like, how does it work?
Yeah. So I'll explain some work I'm doing in this regard at the school I teach at, and kind of talk through what that looks like concretely. But I want to say at the outset that I'm drawing on a lot of different current and past traditions to figure this out. And there's a lot of stuff going on around the country right now trying to answer this question. Even if they don't use this exact question, I think this is what's on people's minds. One thing that's out there, that's what I'm working on, is how to work with seniors, in my case, high school seniors, to help them become heroes, the way we're describing it. We don't use that exact term in the program, although maybe I should consider it. But one concrete thing that we ask students to do at the start of the year is focus on themselves and do that inner work that we were talking about at the beginning, and kind of get deeper into the inner work. And so what I mean by that is asking students to identify, for example, in one lesson, all the different parts of their identity that are salient to them. Listing out on a piece of paper the different ways they think about themselves in terms of family and identity and geographic background and race, ethnicity, family history, et cetera. But then also interests, hobbies, friends, things like that. And then in that same sort of period of the year, this is the start of the year, we're having them also think a lot about what values correspond to those identities or come out of those identities or relate to them. So we're starting with what's inside them, basically. Simultaneously, in the sort of external deep way of thinking about this, we're also having them engage with texts that help stimulate conversation around identity and values. So for example, early in the year, we read a very short excerpt from Confucius, in which Confucius is telling the story of how he goes to some village, and in that village, a man says, "My father stole a sheep, and we are so proud that we did not tell on him. We kept this a secret, and he's because our family values were the most important thing." And Confucius says in this parable that I'm paraphrasing here somewhat, and where I come from, we value the son who turns in his father because the state and the society's values and needs need to trump the families or whatever. But so we read that, and then students talk about who they think is right. But in that conversation, if you're doing this in a sort of thoughtful way, next thing you know, they're talking about their own values and their own identities. Yeah. So that's a specific example of how we start the year in this program to help them reflect on these kinds of values and identities they're bringing to the table.
Yeah. And then how is that important? I mean, so let's say it works and someone they go through the identity process, they come out at the values and and they have a sense of oh, I've made explicit all these values that were probably implicit, because no one, until they come to your class, no one's sits around with their friends drinking soda and writing down their values. But now they do. And how is that beneficial?
Because your values are then going to inform, for what we're doing in this program, they become the lens through which you're investigating careers and life futures for yourself. And so we're then turning that sort of lens, that values object they've made, into a lens that they hold up, and they like binoculars or something. They look around at the world around them, and they wait until something lights up. We have them look at different career options. We use all these going back to the sort of external part of the quadrants, very practical documents, the government has websites about which jobs are out there and which jobs will experience the most growth in the next 10 years, that kind of thing. And then also there's websites and ways you can look at what is entailed in each career.
Yeah.
And so if I'm a young person and I realize I'm kind of an introvert and I'm really interested in design, and I also come from this community and I'm really interested in giving back to that community, I then hold up this lens I've created as the young person, and I scan the world, and I see teacher, for example, and I'm like, nope, that's not involved. You can't be an introvert as a teacher. You can, but they may not think that. And then you turn it, and next thing you know, you find interior design. But you wouldn't want to do interior design where you're the person going to the house to try to sell the interior design. You'd want to work at the interior design firm on the back end, making the designs. So they're kind of narrowing down possible career paths at step 2 based on those values they've reflected on.
Okay. And so far you've really if I'm the Indian uncle that really wants my son and my nephew to make a lot of money, I'm well, okay, this sounds very nice. There's a nice career. But what does this have to do with their education?
In this program?
Yeah. So let's say I go through it. I'm okay, I want to be an interior designer. I'm in high school.
Right.
How does that affect whether you're teaching me Aristotle or not, or what I'm interested in?
Right. It doesn't. It's gonna, the education that's happening at the start of the program that we're talking about with Confucius and values and identity, that is providing them with this lens to look through.
Yeah.
Once they've used that lens to look through. So for example, say the uncle there are lots of uncles in my students' lives saying things like this, or whoever. And so for some of them, it's really important to establish one of the values is making money.
Yeah.
because I want to be able to support my family, et cetera. So that becomes a value. That's not something that's not, I don't want to say interior design is there's a lot of coding students or students who pursue coding, in the program. So they take all these values, and then what that comes to afterwards, this is now stage kind of 2 or 3 of this program, is I'm now going to do a deep dive as a young person into that career. And the education is, what does it actually take to become that as a career, and then to become excellent at it? And there's lots, I can give you some more specifics in there if you want, but that's the kind of how it shapes the education is, okay, I have these values. This is a career that's out there that seems to align with them. Now let me spend a month or 2 getting into what that career entails. And that's my education. That's what I'm learning in the program.
That's cool. I get that. But my question is, do I still have to take social studies and French?
Or in the future education system?
Yeah. Or can I only take the things that lead to interior design or coding?
Yeah. I would say that in this future education system in which this kind of program, say, is happening, one of the reasons I'm working with seniors is a hypothesis I'm working under is that this, again, going back to the sequential stages idea, this kind of work can be in parallel with traditional academic work, but that's at a minimum, it needs to be in parallel. And I would argue in some cases it needs to come a little later after certain foundations are laid. Because if you spend too much time on this at the beginning, you're going to end up with students who are incredibly enthused about who they are and what they're going to do in the world and don't have the academic chops to pull it off. Like I think you need a history class or an English class or a math class or a coding class or whatever to have the academic abilities that then allow you to, which I can give you an example of if you want, but like allow you to then live out your purpose and become a hero.
Okay. I'm gonna challenge that. So
please,
have you heard of, I'm sure you've read books on this. I heard this phrase the other day that I hadn't heard before. And I'm like, oh, this is interesting. Maybe you've heard of it. It's called motivational learning or motivated learning.
Yeah, say more.
Okay, cool. So before I get into that, I'm just going to give a little personal context. So last couple of years, I have this business doing coaching, executive coaching, conflict resolution, mediation, some of the stuff like this. You're part of the coaching program, you know about it. But one of the things I learned, and it's kind of crystallized learning from the last few years of my life, is that people don't want to learn something. It's really hard for them to learn it. And in the coaching world, that's like if you give people just advice off the street, they will never take it. And in my program, I'm giving people assignments all the time. And the people, and they've all paid, like usually a pretty large amount of money, and they trust me. And sometimes they still, like half the time, they don't do the assignments because they're just not. There's a lot of resistance. Maybe they're not motivated. Maybe they're not ready to deal with it. But it takes a lot of effort for someone to. I mean, that's not the right way of saying it. It's much rarer than I would have thought for people to learn something. And the critical quantity or quality rather that I'm seeing is just desire to learn. And as a kid, I was a very traditionally academic student for whatever reason. Maybe it was my mom. I'm sure it was my mom. In fact, I was very motivated to learn everything and to get very high grades, and I did that. And anything that would not contribute to my high grades, I would not do. So like in the PE thing, unless it was going to get me like whatever, I just found out like, what am I going to need to get the A in PE that I need? So my GPA stays at 4.0. I would do that. The other things I would just like suck at, And so I never learned how to stretch. I broke the 10-minute mile because that was required. And then below that, I was just like, there's no reason to run, faster than 9:59. So going back to this thing, and I have half of my friends here homeschool. And there's this concept that they introduced me to called motivational learning or motivated learning. And it's basically like, let the kid learn what they want to learn, whatever they're interested in. And they're just going to learn really quickly because they're really, so if the kid's like really into frogs, they're going to learn all kinds of weird taxonomic things about frogs that I never cared about. And eventually, I think the theory is eventually, due to their interest in learning, they're going to have to learn all this other stuff like math because they're going to have to count the number of frogs that they want to see, or reading because they've got to read the book that has like the illustrated book about frogs or whatever it is. So to me, I was just like, wow, that would deal with this issue where you have all these kids in school that clearly don't want to be there. They're not paying attention. They're not engaged because they're just not, it's not like matching up with their center of interest. And one of the ways those kids are often viewed in society is like problem kids, or they don't know how to learn. And I don't know, maybe that's true sometimes, but it seems to me that they probably are like really passionate about something that's just not what's being delivered in the classroom. So how does that?
Yeah. No, it's a great point. I think going back to this, the dialectic or the idea of like productive conflict, there's a productive tension between motivation in education and traditional skills, traditional like reading, writing, arithmetic, that way of thinking about learning. And like I was saying before, this is all over the country right now. There's these flowers shooting up about this exact thing, about like how can we incorporate motivation, student identity, students' personal lives and personal interests into the educational process. And one of the ways you can think about it is that motivation is a fuel. Motivation is a fuel that can then, like you were saying with the frogs, like get that student through maybe a math class they don't want to take because they can't become a frog biologist, an amphibian biologist, whatever, without STEM. And they may not even like the experience of STEM per se, but they're going to go through it because on the other side is this thing waiting for them. And so you can think of it as a fuel or as like a gravitational force pulling you forward through things, building momentum. So I think it's huge. I think you're totally right to identify it as often a missing ingredient in what's happening in the K-12 system in America right now. And I myself have as a teacher, created classrooms where that was present and where it wasn't. And I've seen the difference. And this program has a lot of that built in. The idea that motivation is central to what's happening, because without motivation, why would you get through a tough 4-year college experience? Or why would you get through that first bad boss in your career? But to kind of explore this tension a little more, there was a student this year who wanted to be an actuary, which I had to Google what that is. And I think they run risk analysis for insurance companies, I've discovered. And so she wanted to be an actuary. And so one of the things I want them to do, again, in the kind of the middle of the program is like, okay, you pick a field based on your values, interests, talents, and then I want you to really do the work of the field to a certain extent as a senior in high school. Going back to what we were saying earlier about how do you let them taste these things?
Yeah.
So we Googled and found an actuary association in America, which of course there is. And we called them and we asked them, and she was on the phone because we're practicing like how to, talk to people you don't know, all that kind of thing.
Wow.
So she's explaining her interests. I'm there kind of supporting. And we determined that the best thing you can do as an 18-year-old is take an online actuary course that real actuaries take, that if you've taken it, you then actually don't need to take it later and you look amazing to employers because you're like, I already did this thing that nobody knows about. So we signed her up for it. And another thing I discovered about actuaries is a lot of math is involved.
Oh, yeah. It's all math.
Right. So being an English teacher, I was like, oh, look at that. Practical applications of math. They always said there were. No, I believe there's practical applications. So,
so funny.
She sits down with this online, it's on her laptop. And one of the things I'm doing all day is walking around different desks where one student is learning how to paint and other students learning how to be an actuary. It's really fun for me. And so I get to her desk and she shows me where she is, day 2 of this, or whatever. And she's got a little notebook and she starts trying to explain to me the math she's doing. And she basically loses me very quickly. Like she's much more talented at math than I am now, let alone at 18. And so I'm saying all that to say she couldn't, at that stage in 12th grade, for an actuary professional training for real actuaries, she's not going to learn the math fast enough to keep up if she has to learn it. At that stage, she has to know this math already from math class to be able to do this. But to your point, I think there's no reason we can't have that productive tension throughout the process. What I'm saying is just that I think one of the tensions in education broadly in the K-12 space is the number of students involved and the number of teachers across the country, like the ratio there. To do this right, we're going to have to, at least at the beginning, this might be a multi-stage process, but at least in the beginning, we're going to have to find a way where students already have some traditional skills infused into their program as an education, so that when the motivation is coming in, because you can lose your motivation without the skills.
Yeah,
if they don't time
that,
right.
That stuff in that other quadrant, like the internal specific quadrant of the perceived self-efficacy and the grit and all that.
Right. Yeah. But also the opportunity to, because the homeschooling model is a really powerful one. In a lot of ways, there's ideas in there that are like this kind of utopian in a good way version of education, where it's like really is one child and often somebody who loves them and is in their family helping them grow. And so the question is how to translate what's happening in spaces like that to this model where a lot of us in the K-12 space have 30 kids in a room for 45 minutes, you know?
Yeah. And it seems to me the main tension is that, not, I was going to say efficiency, but even more than efficiency, just for the sake of like basic order and functioning, if you have 20 or 30 kids, they have to be doing something that's like roughly the same.
Right.
Otherwise, it's just not gonna work. So to start from a place where like, all right, everybody do. I mean, it's what happens in my child's kindergarten, where it's like, here's a bunch of stations, and then there's a door to go outside, and it's like everybody just do what you want,
right.
And they do, but the ratio there is probably like 18 kids to 3 teachers. So
and there's a certain number of stations, right?
Yeah.
It's not whatever you want, like go to CVS. You know, it's like there's 8 things you could do.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, and that would just be harder as kids' interests got more diverse. But then you have computers and stuff that could potentially
and there's
many
totally yeah. No, I think part of what we're exploring here is the question of how do we ensure students are learning the right thing, like the right answer, the right way to do something, or the way we traditionally done it. And that requires what you're saying, which is there can only be so many things happening in a room at the scale of American high school or K-12 education for any one teacher or 2 teachers or 3 teachers to track what kids are doing. If every kid is literally doing their own thing, like one of the problems I've run into, which is a great problem, but it kind of gets at what we're talking about. I didn't know what an actuary was. And I don't know enough math at this point in my life to help this student through the program.
Yeah.
I also don't know how to paint. And there was this young woman painting, and there was a guy using electrical kits to build circuits or something I didn't totally follow. And so if we're talking about this kind of education, we're asking teachers, which I think is something we can ask of them, but in the right ways, to then become to think of teaching differently.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's a different way of thinking about teaching. But I think we can't, if we lose sight of the traditional reading, writing, arithmetic teaching, there's some way to balance these two, because otherwise you have everybody loving what they're doing and nobody's getting any better at it unless they happen to get better by accident, and everybody getting better at the same thing very quickly.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And it's kind of more like the way I run this, or we run this coaching program, where like I don't know what the people in our program are all entrepreneurs, and I don't know what I can't do anything they're doing, right. But I can still support them incredibly, and like, help them cultivate breakthroughs, because I'm operating on this other level of how they relate to themselves, how they relate to others, how they relate to their future, how they relate to their past. That's all tied up in that. So maybe at the end of the day, at the end of the 13 years from the K through 12 educational system, what is like the key takeaway that you want these kids to have? Because they're not going to, let's say we'll just take it for granted. They're not going to remember any of the facts or any of the details. 20 years later, they're like 40 or 50. They're looking back on their educational system. They're like, this is what I got out of that. Like, what do we want that person to say?
Yeah. I'll answer that. But on a side note, one of the most hilarious, but also tragic somehow things about teaching, which I think is true and reminds me of I don't know if this is what they really do, but Buddhist monks have this idea. Sometimes they'll draw on the sand, very beautiful, exquisite, detailed, and then they just erase them afterwards, and as a sign of impermanence. So teaching is a little bit like that, where like the number of hours you spend preparing and teaching and grading versus the amount of specific things a student remembers a year later, not even to mention 20, like you see them in the hallway the next year and you're like, remember that book? And they're like, oh yeah, that book. And in your mind, you're like, I was up till 1 a.m. so many nights with that book, looking at your writing, et cetera. But no, to your point, that's the way it should be. And what happens is that all these details sink down and become something very foundational in aggregate. So I would say, I would look back at my own education in this regard, and not to say that the way my life rolled out is the way everybody should or could, but to answer your question, I've been thinking recently, how come I'm doing this program? How come I'm running this program at my school? We just launched it a couple of years ago. I've been getting ideas from all over the place, working with lots of colleagues, but ultimately, on some level, if I wasn't there and I wasn't me right now, it wouldn't be happening. It's not all me, obviously, but that's a factor in this. So what is it that has led me to that moment? because the reason I'm asking this question is I feel very actualized.
Yeah.
And partly it's Momentum Lab. And again, I feel very grateful to you all for that. Like in my personal life, I'm feeling very actualized, but I also feel very actualized at work. And so I would want students to feel actualized, like who they are, who they're becoming is becoming actual, is existing in the world in some way they can see. And so to answer your question, maybe the one from before, for me, I had these experiences where like in high school, I went to high school in New York, to Fieldston, which is a private school in New York. And there's a big focus on ethics. And there's also like a day every year where at the time we were just happy to get out of class, but looking back on it, it was kind of profound, where one day a year in high school, we paused to decide whether the school was still lining up with its mission. And if not, what should be done about that? And again, when you're a teenager, this you sometimes you take this seriously. Sometimes you're like, I don't have classes today. This is awesome. But to what we were just saying, that sinks in.
Mm-hmm.
And so here I am, 30 years later, asking the same question of the educational system I'm operating in. In American K-12 education, are we aligned to our mission? And if not, what could we do? And then in college, I was in this great books program as a freshman called SLE that, as you know well, was all about kind of reimagining your life if you lived it in a way that connected the books you were reading and the friends you had and the dorm room you lived in with like the life you wanted to lead, like this kind of holistic way of thinking about things. And so then I'm looking at how like Socrates taught Plato, but Plato kind of disagreed with him. Plato taught Aristotle. Aristotle totally disagreed with Plato, but Aristotle spent 20 years at Plato's school, like 20 years. And then he founded his own school. So then that goes in there somewhere.
Yeah.
And then I get to my professional life and I'm undertaking this apprenticeship and teaching, struggling mightily, getting through it to your point, because I'm motivated. There's something pulling me through. There's some fuel I'm using to push through the dip. And I'm also at a school where the premise this is North Star Academy in Newark in New Jersey. The premise of the school in part is like, how can we continually improve? So my own experience as a student then in high school and college, then as a student, so to speak, as a teacher, was constantly, the context was always like, what could be better? What could change? How could I get better? How could the things around me get better? How could the world get better? And so here I am in the middle of my career doing this program. What do I want students to be getting out of education? What do I think the American child ideally would be feeling at the end of 13 years of school? What do I want my daughters to feel? I want them to feel that self-actualization, self-authorship, heroism is possible, is happening already, and is a seed to be cultivated or a path to be walked. So it's incomplete, but it's begun. And the more they follow it and the more they adhere to certain principles, the more they'll get to feel the way they want to feel and live the way they want to live.
Hmm. Yeah. Wow. It's beautiful.
I love where you take these. I'm learning all sorts of things right now too. This is amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, I really had no agenda. I just knew it was going to be awesome. I'm just full of confidence, full of confidence. I'd like to share, I'd like to share what I got out of school, because I think it's similar, but in a way maybe more basic. Like I feel like I left high school, and going to Stanford with this idea that I'm a smart and capable person and I can do anything I want. And maybe that's synonymous with privilege. And the word privilege, it's used in like all these different, it's kind of used as like a insult or a hammer sometimes, but it's privilege, and it's like I had that because of my mom, I think is a big part of it, but also like my way of being worked really well with like the factory industrial educational model. And I was like really good at standardized tests from the beginning. And I was lucky that way. And so I had this privilege to come out of it, even though the school system represents such a small fraction of how humans do things in the world. I just didn't know that. And I felt like because I was good at school, I would be good at anything. And it just set me up with this belief that it turned out to be not, not necessarily accurate. Like prima facie is like, there's no way that being good at school is going to make you be good at farming, which I spent a lot of time doing. or building like natural buildings with my hands, like clay, or making music, which is a big part of my life, or even like hanging out with people, or like learning different languages, or, you know, all this stuff that I became like major facets of my life. But I didn't know that at the time. And so I went into all those other experiences with this naive sense that I would be able to do anything. But that belief is really, it can be very self-fulfilling. And so it turns out that I was able to do all those things, I think in large part because I had this core belief instilled in me through the educational system that I could just do it.
So are you saying that did you also discover in these different settings, farming, et cetera, that did you also have a moment where you're like, oh, I actually am not good at this, even though I was told I was good at everything, but I can get better? Or was the experience more like from the beginning, you were like, I'll also just figure this out? There was no sort of doubt moment, or was there one?
There's some diversity there. With most of those things, there was no doubt. And I just went in with confidence, and I kind of didn't notice that I wasn't great at it for a while. And then I just got competent. But with music, it was very clear from the very beginning that I was atrocious and tone deaf. And then there was this real like many year doubt and dip and self-flagellation. And, you know, it was like, that was a whole other thing. And that was kind of like my second education. The first was like the school system. And the second was like learning how to do music and learning how not to be tone deaf. And that's where I really learned at the end that like, oh, now I know I can do anything. Now it's not just a belief that was actually misguided but helpful, but now I actually know that I can do anything because I did this thing that was just horribly hard.
I think that the reason I'm asking partly is I think that the story, or the first story you're telling about the kind of student you were, when I was that kind of student in a lot of ways too, there's a certain kind of student for whom the education system confirms their self-worth.
Yeah.
And that doesn't necessarily though mean that they are then set, because I would argue that confirmation itself can be dangerous if it's felt the wrong way or whatever.
Yeah.
But there are also students, as we both know, who the education confirms for them a doubt they have about themselves from the beginning.
Yeah.
Right. And I think the thing I think is so interesting is we need to go back to your question. We need an American school system that is helping both kinds of students become authors of their own lives, become the heroes of their own lives. But those types of students need different things in some ways.
Yeah.
And totally. I think your second point about music, that's something I've been thinking about a lot, is how to create productive failure in classrooms and in schools, because failure is waiting for all of us. And often it's the thing we fail at that initially, that if we accept that failure, that's the thing that will derail us. Like if I'd accepted, I was not a great teacher at the start. I, good instincts, and things that were the seeds of good teaching, but I was not a good teacher. Very few people are at the very beginning. But I had these amazing mentors and friends and colleagues around me at the school who were helping me get better. And something pulled me through that failure. Something pulled you through the music failure. And I don't know if we got it in our education or not. And if we didn't, how do we make sure everybody can get whatever it was that got us through that failure? How can everybody get that before they finish high school in the country?
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I definitely did not get that in my education. I got the opposite. I got like, if you're not good at it, just stop.
Right. Yeah.
You're not good at art. You're not good at music. You're not good at working with your hands. Just don't take those classes.
Right. Yeah. But I think Mr. Woolley, shout out to Mr. Woolley, had he been with you, say, for half your, he had 4 periods, Mr. Woolley, and it wasn't just history, it was all sorts of things. That kind of teacher, he himself, and that kind of teacher probably wouldn't have given you that sensation. That's not to say any teacher is deliberately doing that, but everybody's in a different place in their own growth and their own ability as a teacher. And the school system itself, the larger structure, is one in which the default mode is like good or bad. It's like binary. And if you're bad, then it's like a decision tree. Then you go this direction.
Yeah.
But I still say I'm bad at math. I almost said it earlier talking about the actuary student. And I still have to condition myself as an adult to be like, no, you just didn't learn as much as you could. You could learn more if you wanted to.
Yeah.
So I think going back to the question of what school would look like, we need students who are motivated in school, delighted by the frogs, chasing the frogs, learning math to count the frogs. And also we need to make sure that student and all students fail at some point in a way that really feels like failure, are with supporting adults and caregivers and peers around who can then turn around and help them reflect and grow from it. Because if we don't have the experience of failure in a setting in which people are going to help us get back up, which is what I had as a young teacher, who would go through failure, right?
Yeah, and there's this deeper, I just felt like sunk into this deeper realization of, great, I want people to leave school feeling like I did. Everybody smart, capable, we can do anything, fine. That's all great. But even below that, that like I would love to feel, and for all of us to feel through our education system and not through the trials and tribulations later in life, that we're fundamentally lovable and valuable regardless of how well we do in any one of these pursuits, which to me is like it's like part of what you just said about failure, that like you can just suck at something important to you and have people support you and love you and be like, dude, it's all right. Like we're still here for you. We cherish you. We want to, we believe in you. We want you to be happy. We want to support you. Like that at this like deep level of just personal, ego in the most positive sense, like ego formation and like just being like an intact little creature. That, I mean, maybe that's even the deepest dream.
Yeah, and going back to the very beginning with the kind of pluralism in the classroom idea, that no matter what you're teaching, what age level, your daughter's kindergarten, my daughter's first grade, that the sort of foundation of a healthy classroom and a healthy learning experience, which you could definitely make happen in every classroom in America. It wouldn't be easy, but it's something that we know how to do, is an affirming space, culturally affirming, personally affirming, and affirming of who you are as an individual, in addition to whatever skills you have or don't have in that particular class's subject area. And there are super concrete things that educators can do and that people can do, parents, other people, to affirm that. For example, like just to give one, there's an idea that when something doesn't work, when a student or a child does something wrong, quote unquote, they don't do the math right, they don't spell a word right, or they act incorrectly, at home or whatever. The idea is that the child has inherent, profound, permanent worth. The action can be perfect or imperfect based on the context and can get better, but that the child is not what's wrong. The answer is wrong. Or the answer is different than mine, going back to what we were saying, and therefore I have to grapple with it, but I'm not grappling with that person's inherent value. And so, for example, if somebody just says the wrong answer, you're asking a question in English class and you say, what did this character do next in the book? Something that has an answer. And they say the wrong things. They didn't read, or they forgot, or they're distracted when you called on them. If you say in that moment, no, that's not what happened. Other student, what happened? That's one kind of classroom. That's one kind of childhood. If you say, no, that's not what happened, but I'm going to go over here and have somebody give you a clue, and then when I come back to you, phone a friend, or no, it's not what happened, but you're totally right about this part of what you said. This 20% was right. This 80% was wrong, but I'm going to hold on to this 20%. Or they get it wrong, you keep the class moving, and then you come back to them and they get it right 5 minutes before the end of class. That same student gets the right answer. These are all ways that teachers can make sure that classrooms are spaces where young people are affirmed in their inherent value and worth and beauty. But also there's right and wrong, and there's better and worse. Just like in a coaching situation, like you were saying, like you want to help somebody achieve excellence, there is excellence in that field. Also, there's a sense of self-worth that accompanies the pursuit of that excellence.
Wow, that's really, I mean, I'm just thinking of like, I'm trying to teach my daughter how to count, and it's slow. It's slow going. And sometimes, like we're measuring the flour. We make bread every day. We're measuring the flour, and she sees the number on there, and I'm like, hey, what number is that? And it's like, 342, and she's like 20. And I'm like, oh, dude, come on. We've been over this so many times. But I could say, there is a 2 in that number, and there is a 2 in 20.
Or it's more, or it's, the teacher move, again, parent and teacher they're not analogous totally, and there's not always full translation, but like the teacher move in that situation is, it's not single digit, right? How'd you know it was more than 1 through 9? And then she counts. She says there's 3, right? First step. So now if you knew there was more than 1 through 9, you said it was 20. How many? That's 2 different numbers, right? But how many numbers are here? 3, right? So it can't be 20 because there's 3 numbers. But this premise at the beginning is like there was some insight in there that they made, but underneath that insight was a person trying, and you're affirming the trying person. And this is a hard thing with teaching, but everybody gets there eventually. You find the thing that's right. That also indicates a logical or academic process unfolding. Like there's a reason she said 20 and not 2, and you're going to try to hold on, even if your daughter or my daughter or whoever is not actually thinking that way. We're narrating to them like, oh, they see, it looks like you might have engaged in a process that exists in the world, and even if you didn't realize it, I'm now going to say you might have, et cetera.
Wow. Sold. You come here for a week, man. But there's a deep thing in there. Maybe we could just close on this. Sometimes I feel like all of the projects we do and all of the coaching that I go through with people and the goal setting and be like, oh, okay, set this like difficult goal for the next year. The whole point is to awaken inner conflict and resistance and struggle so we can go through it and become better people. Like what I'm going to learn from this whole process is really how to love my daughter in a greater level of detail and how to separate like she can do math versus she is fundamentally valuable. Because like I might say that, but I don't really believe that, because I get frustrated when she can't do math. And so the whole point of every single one of these work projects or parenting projects or whatever is to become just more enlightened and more developed and just more integrated between who I want to be and how I actually am in the world.
Yeah, I have two quick thoughts on that. One is that there's a being becoming idea that Matt talks about in Momentum Lab. It's the plus sign, and this is out there in the world. This idea of like there's a permanent sense of being, and then there's an ongoing evolution of becoming. And I think to use that language of what we're saying right now, that the goal of a great education system, a great classroom, a great home, et cetera, a great workplace, is one in which everybody's being is affirmed, but they are nurtured and supported in their becoming, which sometimes involves saying they're wrong or that wasn't good enough or you can get better. But the tandem is key there, is that your being has inherent worth, and there's a love undergirding this interaction between us. And the external becoming thing, like you can get better at your scales, you can get better at shooting free throws, and I'm going to show you one idea to do that, and then the cycle continues. And a story quickly about that maybe will help illustrate this in the education setting is a student named Elijah was in this program a few years ago and wanted to be a writer and wasn't sure what he wanted to do and was struggling with this sense of like, how do I get my voice in the world? I have a voice, how do I get it in the world? Does my voice belong in the world? And he felt that the American university system was pressuring students of color and first-gen college students to, he called it, sell their pain in their college applications. And this is the topic that's going to come up more and more now with the recent Supreme Court decision and the emphasis college essays are going to get in the application process now. So he was thinking about this, and he felt defeated in some ways by this experience of applying to college and feeling this pressure from the colleges to sell his pain. And so what he did was he transmuted that frustration and that sense of doubt into an article he wrote with his help from a journalist that got published in the New York Times, where the headline was something like, when I applied to college, I didn't want to sell my pain. And here he is, a high school senior, a few years ago. We can post a link, or his name's Elijah Megginson. He posted this article in the Times. Now he's at Morehouse. He got into Stanford, by the way, after posting this article, and then decided not to go, which I loved. Love Stanford, but I love Elijah's decision. Goes to Morehouse. He becomes a Times core member, which is like the New York Times is like an up-and-coming journalist pipeline they're building. He's in that now. He met with Nicole Hannah-Jones, who's this really prominent Black journalist in America. So here he is now in the middle of college on this journey that began with doubt, but the doubt itself was not about him. He felt confident that he personally could address a situation that was giving him doubt. Mm. And so he's becoming something, but the becoming a big, maybe a prominent American journalist in the future if he wants to be, that becoming is grounded in affirmations of being that also relate to very concrete classroom practices and school structures and amazing family and all that were in his life. And so there's this, going back to the quadrants, like if you picture it as a flat plane, every one of them is sending a line upwards, and a student who can mix all these lines into that spiral or whatever, their rocket ship's taking off.
Love it. All the metaphors, Mike.
A lot of metaphors.
Thank you.
Can you imagine Mr. Taubman's classroom? The students are like, all right, Mr. T, the first two I understood. The third was just gratuitous.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us, man.
This is fascinating, and it spurred my own thinking in a lot of ways. So to be continued. Thank you.
Hey, it's me again. If you like this episode and it made a contribution to your life, please consider signing up for the newsletter, because that would make a contribution to my life. Basically, what I'm looking for is more direct interaction with my listeners so I can improve the show. And the best way to do that is signing up for the newsletter, and then we can get into some tasty email discussions and the like. All right. Thanks.